All right, we've hit 12. The participants are slowly coming in. What I might do is do a brief intro, and then by the time I get through that, Owen, I'll hand over to you. Okay, so I guess good afternoon and welcome to the first of this year's series of FSAA webinars. My name is Stephen Connors, CEO of the FSAA, and I'll be hosting today's webinar with our special guest, Owen Tong. With IFRS 17 fast approaching, the professionals within our industry are seeking further detail and training on the potential application of this standard. And for this reason, we were keen as an association to provide an opportunity for members to get more exposure to certain subtopics within the standard, which are generating challenges in their interpretation and the application. This webinar has been designed to provide further clarity on the concepts of level of aggregation and how the standard applies to portfolios, portfolio groups, issuance groups, etc. The format of the webinar will be around 40 minutes of presentation, followed by some Q&A time at the end where you can have the opportunity to ask questions of Owen via the chat. So without further ado, the FSAA is proud to introduce Owen Tong. Now, I'll just go into a little bit of Owen's bio just before I hand over to Owen. So Owen is the founder and managing director of Real Value Consulting. He's currently specialising in the interpretation application of IFRS 17 and has a wealth of specific knowledge on this topic. He's built a number of IFRS 17 PAA eligibility models and has assisted companies such as QBE, Westpac, Deloitte, AMP, and Hanover in their implementation journeys. He has a deep passion for education and strives to help people really understand the what, why, and how of what they're doing. And he's also teaching at Macquarie University in the fields of actuarial studies, finance, and statistics over many years, and is also the founder of a secondary tuition centre called Real Value Tuition. So Owen, I want to hand over to you now, and thank you so much for joining us today. And I know this is a really important topic for our members, so it's great you've been able to join us. Over to you.
Thanks for that. So I thought it would be a good idea just before I start launching into the presentation, just to do a poll. It'll only consist of one question. And the question's supposed to gauge, I guess, how much effort your company has spent looking into the level of aggregation, which is the topic for today's presentation. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to launch this. And if you guys just can just click on the number between 0 and 5, where 5 is should be representing the situation where your company has spent a significant amount of effort, and 0 is a situation where you haven't looked into it at all. So I'm just going to launch that now. Just give another half a minute. It looks like we have a kind of like, and I'm not sure if I can share the results after, but just looking at the results, it kind of like have a even, kind of like almost like an even playing field between 0 and 5, a little bit more skewed between 3, 4, and 5. Let me see if I end the poll, I can share the results. So you guys should be able to see the results so far. So it seems like kind of like 30%, or the majority of the spike is at kind of like 3, thought about it a little bit, and we do have more towards the, I guess, 3, 4, and 5 end, which is not surprising because IFRS 17 comes into effect next year. So the purpose of today's presentation is for me to just share just my company's views on, I guess, how the standard paragraphs apply to something practical, how to interpret some of the paragraphs. And I will be taking you guys through how I see some of these paragraphs apply specifically to the levels of aggregation. So to those who have voted 0, 1, and 2, hopefully this will give you guys a little bit of something else to think about. For those 3, 4, and 5, this could give you something in addition, like an alternative view, or maybe it could re-emphasize, I guess, the trajectory that you guys have already gone on. And I just want to caveat again that none of these views are the views of anything set by the ISP. They're my personal and my company's views only. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'll just launch into the presentation. Okay, so I'm just going to start. Okay, so today we're going to go through the levels of aggregation, and just at a high level, there are 3 parts that I'm going to talk about today. So the first one would be, how does that apply to portfolios, or where does that fit in? The second one is this concept called profitability groups. And the third one are these things called issuance groups. Then I'm going to summarize right at the end. I have an illustration where I put these 3 together in an illustration. Hopefully it'll be sufficient for you guys to see how everything comes together. One of the areas which I do find coming up time and time again is that people kind of like dwell on one of these 3 areas, but not look at these 3 areas together. And so I want to talk through these 3 areas one by one and then put them all together. And so there are, I guess, 3 levels of grain. And the way they work is that the portfolio will be the highest level of grain. And then we're going to go down to profitability groups, and then finally to issuance groups. So we're going to start off with portfolios first. So, and in this presentation, I will have snapshots of the paragraphs from IFRS 17. And so I will talk about these paragraphs and also explain my interpretation of these. We're not going to read every word, but I'll just highlight the important parts. So IFRS 17 requires us as insurers to sort out our contracts into these portfolios of insurance contracts that you see here in the italics. And there are 2 key features of these portfolios. And one is that the contracts need to have sorted into the same portfolios, must have a theme of being similar enough in risks and being managed together. And so these are 2 core themes that will come out again as I'm talking through different ideas of how you may segregate your portfolios. And so this paragraph 14 of IFRS 17 then goes on to state that contracts in a certain product line are expected to have similar risks and therefore be managed together. And that shouldn't be of surprise, because as businesses, we generally want to look at, I guess, certain segregations that make sense. And so it makes sense if there are similar enough to produce the numbers for those businesses or those contracts in aggregate. And for life insurance, they come with an example of saying that single premium fixed annuities are kind of like different in a way to regular term life insurance. And I just also want to caveat before I move too deeply in that a lot of my illustrations are focused towards the general insurance side rather than to the life insurance side. So the next bit that I want to talk about is the current general insurance AASB 1023 standard. And the reason I want to draw upon this is that this part here of segregating into portfolios of insurance contracts being similar risks isn't the first time we've seen this in I guess, in an official wording. We've also seen this turn up in the liability adequacy test in the AASB 1023. So section 9 in the liability adequacy test does state that portfolio of contracts are subject to broadly similar risks and are managed together. So you see the same themes come out again. And it's not of surprise, because when we look at where AASB 1023 comes from, it comes off the back of AASB 4. So AASB 4 is the standard that IFRS 17 replaces. So in the past, when AASB 4 came about, our accounting standards boards decided to issue AASB 1023 for general insurance and AASB 1038 for the remaining insurance companies to as a supplementary document to apply AASB 4. And AASB 4 was always meant to be a stepping stone for the IASB, because IASB wanted to move towards a certain direction, but there's a lot of work to be done, and it took a huge amount of time to get to where we are. But now here we are, and IFRS 17 actually replaces the IFRS 4, AASB 4, which is why, in my opinion, you see the same words of similar risks and managed together. So they've always had the intention of segregating the contracts like that. So how can we sort them into these portfolios from like a practical lens? Well, before I go into, I have 4 slides after this one where I give kind of like my take of 4 separate possibilities. But the general principles, in my opinion, should be that it should pass a sniff test. And so if we think about similar risks, if we look at certain contracts in the same portfolio, and if we've just from a gut feel perspective, if it's so different, so for example, motor contracts or private motor contracts and marine contracts, and we're saying they're broadly aligned. Well, first of all, one's on the land and one's in the sea. And then there are a whole suite of other differences between those 2 contracts, then it may not pass the sniff test. So I think regardless of which direction your company chooses to go, it should overall just feel right. And if it doesn't feel right, then it probably means that you need a significant amount of explanation to do to get that through the auditors. Because at the end of the day, the auditors will also apply one of these lenses. So they'll look at it and they'll think, well, does this even feel right? And if it doesn't, there will be more questions to explain. And then the logic used to segregate these portfolios, it should be consistent throughout the different parts of the business. So for example, if you're using one logic to sort these contracts into these portfolios, but then at a different part of the business, your logic completely changes only because it produces a certain outcome, even though there's no real reason to apply a separate logic, then it could be harder to get across the auditors. So from a holistic point, if it's just one company, it should apply one consistent principle across how you're going to sort these contracts into these different portfolios. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just give you guys 4 separate ideas, and these are just ideas because there's no correct answer. There are just different interpretations that you guys could entertain over your IFRS 17 journey. So this is the first conceptual illustration. And so what I have here is that pretend that each one of these bits are an insurance contract. And what I want to highlight here is that think of your company as just having like a pool of insurance contracts. And then you need to group them in certain ways. And as an analogy, if you think of just you have a room and you have a messy room and you have to sort your clothes into different boxes, right? So you generally you might sort them according to their colors, or you might sort them according to their types, right? Trousers together, tops together, or you might sort them according to formal wear, non-formal wear, etc. With insurance businesses, I like to think of your contracts in a similar way. There are different ways you can sort them. as long as you're sorting them according to a consistent set of themes and principles. And so in this illustration, what the principle here is sorting them according to, I guess, the risk type. So you might have policies that are insuring the home. You have policies that are insuring the commercial, the CTP, or private motor. And so this is one potential way that you could go down to sort your insurance contracts into these different buckets. And this is what a lot of general insurers are already doing. And so one of the advantage of doing it this way is that if you're already set up to do it in this way, then extracting data or the data mappings might already be there. And in terms of presenting the results, say you have to measure your insurance contracts according to these types of portfolios and presenting them to your management teams, that could already be quite normal. And so management's already used to the results presented in these format. So that could be some of the, I guess, the quick wins of doing it this way. But one of the areas where I think you need to be careful if you're doing it in this way is that these are contracts. And so from an actuarial point of view, the actuaries may consider this in their reserving process. They look at risks. And so you could have a situation where you have one policy, so one of these contracts spanning multiple risks. And when you have one contract spanning multiple risks, that's when you potentially might get into an issue, because we're sorting contracts and we're not sorting risks within a contract. And so that's something that you may need to think about a little bit more, because IFRS 17 is applicable to the insurance contracts themselves. And one contract could have multiple different types of risks. So the second illustration that I have over here, it really is kind of like a higher tier compared to the first illustration. So in the first illustration, I was saying you could look at this as kind of like a home and contents business, or the CTP business, or a private motor business. You may have a situation where, let's just say you might be a small insurer potentially, or maybe even a large insurer, and you have good justification where your management team has always looked at your personal lines worth of business and your commercial lines worth of business completely separately. And you may have an argument to say the personal lines of business, the risks are similar enough, and they're also managed together. And the same principles apply to the commercial lines of business. And if you're able to argue it in that fashion, then you have some additional advantages. So you still have the advantage of the facts that you might already have your data systems in place to view it in this manner, but you also have added advantages where the higher up you go in your portfolio, there are less levels of granularity. And the more levels of granularity you have, the more work that you need to separate your numbers into those levels of grain, the more reconciliations you might need to do, the more potential data risk you might have of getting the data mappings wrong. And so the higher up you go, there's a balance between less work or less effort getting everything to match up versus, I guess, if these risks are not similar anymore, because eventually the highest tier will be the company level, where definitely it's hard to argue that all of the risks within the company issued policies are similar. So those are some of the areas that you might need to think about when we're considering this. So this is the third illustration that I'm going to go through. And this is one area where a lot of insurers, a lot of larger insurers will have, which are the brands. And so many insurers have grown through acquiring different companies or merging different companies together. And so each company before they've been sort of acquired had a specific purpose or a specific risks that they are really targeting in the market. So potentially another idea could be looking at brands. And you can see that I've segregated these differently. So for the same contracts, we could say this top bit would be the first brand, this bottom bit will be the second brand, and they're looking at different, they're targeting different sectors of the market. And the sectors of the market that they are targeting has a different risk profile. And you could argue that the management team also looks at these brands differently, because that's basically how they've been looking at it in the past. So one of the care or risks in this way is that you could have a brand and that's different from a second brand, but you could have risks between, say, brand 1 or brand 2 that are similar. So you could have brand 1 and brand 2 both insuring motor vehicles. And then should you group it by motor vehicles or should you group it by a brand? So that's something that you'll need to play towards. And it probably needs a bit more thought, because you can't group, say, half of the business by brand and the other half by one of these risks types without good justification for doing so. So, but it's just an idea that you could potentially approach it in this manner. And some of the larger insurers like IAG or Suncorp, they have many different brands within their suite of insurance contracts. And the final one that I want to talk about is potentially by geographical location. And this probably, in my opinion, applies more towards monoline insurers. Say you only have one type of insurance product that you're selling, but you're selling it to different geographical locations. Well, you can't group by brand, probably, because if it's just one product under one brand, you can't group by, I guess, by the different risks, because it's just the one product. But if you're selling towards different geographical areas, potentially you may group by those geographic areas, by state. And so one of the issues of doing it this way could be that if the insurer expands into other product lines, then potentially that could mean that you may need to remap everything, because as you can imagine, if, say, New South Wales, we offer a second offering into the New South Wales line, then this will need to be sliced into potentially 2 segments, New South Wales offering for product 1 and New South Wales for product 2. So that could be more work down the lines. But for now, if you're a monoline insurer, this could be one idea that you might entertain when you're determining the split or the sorting of your insurance contracts. Now, all of these sorting of the insurance contracts into potentially 1, 2, 3, 4 different ways of segregating them into portfolios, why does that even matter? Well, at the end of the day, we need to present on a statutory basis. And paragraph 78 states that the entity shall present separately for the carrying amount of portfolios, so assets and liabilities for insurance contracts and reinsurance contracts. And so depending on how you segregate your contracts into these portfolios, you would need to present or at least calculate the assets and liabilities position for each one of those portfolios. And so the more portfolios that you have, the more presentations that you have to determine and also to reconcile between your balance states. And so that's something that would need to be carried forwards. Obviously, if you're maintaining this portfolio position, then you want to do that moving forwards. And it's probably also, just in my opinion, harder to change the way you determine portfolios after the fact. Say you've chosen, we're going to run our business according to these types of portfolios from the get-go, and then 2 years down the line, you want to change all of that. It's probably a little bit harder from just a conversational point, but also a data systems point. So you probably want to get all of that right from the start. So that was the portfolios. And now I want to move on to the middle tier, which was profitability groups. And so IFRS 17 has underneath the portfolio line a requirement to then subdivide the portfolio of insurance contracts into a minimum of 3 sub-tiers. And so I'm just going to read this out and then I'm going to explain what I believe each one of these means. So the first one is to divide them into a group of contracts that are onerous at initial recognition. And part B is a group of contracts that at initial recognition have no significant possibility of becoming onerous subsequently. And part C, a group of the remaining contracts in the portfolio, if any. And I just want to explain this in layman's terms. And so when IFRS 17 came out, there was kind of like one of the motivations was that when investors looked at the financial statements, it was very hard to disseminate the, I guess, the product itself of the insurer and the profitability of each of the products. And so when, say, a non-insurance company sells a bunch of products, it's easy to determine the expected profits and whether or not they were actually making profits at the end. But with an insurance business, you have, I guess, it takes a long time for the profits to earn out. And so when you're selling the policies, which is what initial recognition really alludes to, and I could do a separate session just on what that means compared to subsequent measurement. But when you're selling insurance policies, then at the beginning, insurance companies should have a preconceived expectations of whether they are expecting to make profit, or kind of like if they're not sure, or whether they're thinking based on their modeling, they're expecting these policies could actually be loss-making. And there could be many reasons for why. You might sell a group of insurance contracts that could potentially be loss-making. But based on those expectations from the start, you'll need to sort those contracts out, because these are kind of like profitability tags to say, right, we're selling this group of business or insurance contracts. We expected to make profit on them. So there could be no possibility of them becoming onerous, which is basically loss making. So you might have that idea of saying we're selling this group of contracts and we think that it's always going to make profit. But then in subsequent measurements, so in the future, you might measure that same group of insurance contracts and then realize, hang on, it's making losses. But you've already determined at the very beginning that they should be profit making. So this division of your insurance contracts into these three, what I call profitability groups, kind of like in one way keeps you honest from the get-go, and also allows investors to compare kind of like your expected profitability from the very, very beginning when you're selling the contracts versus the profitability over time, which is the subsequent measurement phase. So hopefully you guys can see from kind of like an investor point of view, if they can see this information, or if they're articulated this information, they can see what the original intention or the expectations were compared to what the actual results were. Of course, these are three groups which are the minimum. You're permitted to subdivide these in a little bit more of a grain, and noting that the more granular you get, the more data requirements there are, and the more reconciliations there will need to be. But you may do this if you feel like this could align to, I guess, your internal management reporting. So if your internal management reporting looks at this and says, well, actually, we like to look at this information in a lot more, I guess, different shades of profitability, and that could be a reason why you want to separate this into, rather than 3 tiers of based on profitability, into a few more tiers based on profitability to align to the internal management reporting. So there was this, I guess, mention of onerous contracts over here, and I won't be talking in detail about onerous contracts. I'm happy to I guess cover that in a future webinar. That's a topic all in itself, and it can get a little bit more technical. And so, as I was saying, the 3, just in summary of the previous slide over here, the 3 areas where at a minimum you need to separate your insurance contracts into is are those contracts that are expected to be loss-making from the get-go, the contracts that are we don't have any, I guess, real reason to expect them to be loss-making at all. So we expect them to really be making money. And if you're not sure, everything else, right? So that's paragraph IFRS 17.16. And each one of these, you could have one of these groups and you may not actually have any contracts in them. If you see at the end of each one of these groups, it actually says, if any, and if any, right? So these are kind of like groups there just so that you can put your contracts into, like these buckets. That's why I call these profitability groups or buckets, but you may not actually have any contracts within any one of these groups. Now, a lot of conversations from what I've heard talks about the middle one, which is the no significant expectation of loss making. So what I was saying just before was that you're expecting kind of like to make profit, but there's kind of like a probabilistic element there, like no significant expectation. So what does significant mean? There is no detailed guidance on how to determine what is significant enough. And if there were, then we probably won't be covering this because it'll be a lot more clear. But IFRS 17 does provide some guidance on the revised standard version to say that you need to look at the likelihood of changes in assumptions. So for example, let's just say you have contracts that you're expecting to be profitable, but then you realize that if you're changing, if the loss ratio increases by a little bit, it pushes over and it becomes loss making. And the chances of the loss ratio becoming, I guess, moving in the adverse direction could actually be within reasonable expectations. So that could be a situation where that contract may actually not be in this bucket because there is a definite real expectation or possibility that it could be onerous. So there are, I guess, things that you'll need to sift through to determine whether it falls into the no significant expectation bucket or everything else. And IFRS 17 also alludes to your company's internal reporting. So you can't disregard anything that all the performances of your products within your company that you already have on hand. So you should be looking at that to determine, I guess, the threshold that you might segregate things into. What's important is, what's important based on this is you should also have like a consistent principle that you're going to use and signed off, obviously, to determine which contracts goes into this no significant possibility of becoming onerous bucket, that second bucket, versus the remaining contracts bucket. Because if there's no clarity, like a fixed clarity within your company policy for doing that, then it could be really gray because then it's hard to justify, well, where does this new contract go? There should be some rigor when you're actually determining which bucket it goes into. So the final one that I want to talk about in this category is just the fact that the classifications of these profitability groups, they don't change. So the reason I want to bring this up is because what I've seen is that lots of people have asked, well, let's just say I have product A or product B, and we initially expected this to be, say, loss making, right? Let's just say we expected it to be loss making. So we have placed it in the onerous bucket. Then over time, things have changed and it is, it's now profitable. Does that change the grouping? And the answer is no. So the grouping that you determine is the grouping that applies to the contract has been sorted in from the start, and the grouping doesn't change afterwards. So let's just say you have a contract and you think that the contract will be onerous and it subsequently turns to be profitable. 1 second, sorry. And the contract subsequently turns to be profitable, then what ends up happening is, sure, on a P&L perspective in the future, the contract is profitable. So it's great for your company, but it's still tagged with in the onerous profitability group. So it's kind of like an analogy I like to use is if you think, for those of you guys who have watched Harry Potter, right, you have the sorting hat. And when each student goes into, right, the enrolls in the Harry Potter house, the sorting hat sorts them based on their personality. But, you know, you might be sorted into Slytherin, and you may not have that type of personality, but you've been sorted. And even in the future, if your personality evolves over time, it doesn't matter. You remain in that house, right? So the actual performance over time is independent of your initial sorting. And that's the main point that I want to make on this slide. So in this illustration, if we assume that each contract has a period of 2 years, the reason why this bar goes over a 3-year period is because I'm assuming that you're issuing contracts during the first year. So therefore, a contract issued towards the end of the first year will still have 2 years remaining. If you're looking at, say, in portfolio A, these issuance groups, these contracts, once you've been sorted into the remaining contract bucket or the no significant possibility of becoming onerous bucket, they remain. And if you have in the future a different year of contracts that you're sorting, and we will go into issuance groups just in a second, that gets tagged differently because your underwriting circumstances may have changed. So for the same product in 1 year, you could say these contracts are in the remaining contracts bucket, but next year, the economic circumstances might be more favorable or less favorable. For example, COVID might have hit, but you've already sold the policies. Or you're expecting to sell the policies, but on the original terms. So you may say, well, for this year, the policies are actually onerous. We're expecting them to be onerous because the economic circumstances have changed. So the main point over here is that you can classify for the same product into different profitability groups over time, but it has to be for new policies. But once you classify these policies into those profitability buckets, it doesn't change for that particular policy. New policies can be issued into different buckets, but the ones that you've already tagged, that doesn't change. So the final thing I want to talk about today is this issuance groups, and then I'm going to put them all together in one illustration. So paragraph 22 to 24 of IFRS 17 talks about the fact that in one group, so just to recap, we have portfolios, which are a group or a category of insurance contracts. You sort them into portfolios, and then once you sort them into portfolios, you subsort them based on their initial profitability. Then the next layer, the next tier down, is that you need to sort them into what I call these issuance groups. But you cannot have contracts issued more than 1 year apart within the same group. And so if I have contracts issued across a larger than 12-month period, then I need to divide these contracts into even more granular of a subgroup within the same profitability group. And so this is another level of grain that you need to determine and you need to account for. So we need to divide them into portfolios, then profitability groups, then groups based on issuance. And once you get to that lowest level, that lowest grouping level, that's the level where you need to produce numbers, where you need to what we call measure the insurance contracts on. IFRS 17 talks about how you need to do measuring, like determining the fulfillment cash flows or the CSM if you're doing the general measurement model. Basically, you have to produce numbers for these insurance contracts, and the level in which you have to determine the numbers at are this lowest tier, which is portfolios, then profitability groups, then the issuance groups, and for that bunch of contracts, produce a set of numbers for them, and then you aggregate back up. So one thing I just want to address, and that's the concept of issued. The IFRS, the standard, doesn't define what issued it is. If you go to the appendix where there's a list of definitions, there's no definition of the word issued. So this is open for interpretation, and oftentimes, so insurance contracts that issue to customers not too long before the insurance term begins. You may have circumstances where you might issue an insurance contract and potentially the coverage period starts 10 years down the line, but for most occasions, it's not too many months between when the insurance contract is actually issued and when the actual cover actually starts. Think about in personal lines when you're up for renewal, I believe it's 6 to 8 weeks before your coverage actually starts. You receive the letter of renewal for a general insurance point of view. And so general insurers typically look at the policy writing date or policies written. That's why general insurers look at gross written premium, because we look at kind of like where based it on the inception date of the insurance contract. So one idea just floating around, and now again, this is just my own interpretation and my own, view. Well, given that your issuing date is not too far from, say, the writing date, there, and also if you overlay that with the purpose of IFRS 17 to make it a little bit more transparent and faithful in the presentation to investors, if it's not too much different, but it actually makes it easier and easier to communicate and easier to do for insurance companies, could the writing date, the policy written date, be a good enough proxy for the issuance date? That's just something I'm floating. Or do you need to actually track when you issue the policies? Caveating that most insurance companies don't track that or analyze the date you send the letters out in a great deal of grain. So that's something to discuss further and to think about further. But at this present time, there's no consensus on exactly what the date is for the issuance dates. So just a few key points, and then I'll wrap it up with an illustration putting all of this together. So there can be many issuance groups within a profitability group, and you can group them on the dates the policies were issued from a literal interpretation, or potentially the idea I've just thrown out is that you may group it based on, the policy written or when the inception date of the policy is. And noting that you can't have those dates spanning more than 12 months apart within the same issuance group. Once an insurance contract has been placed into an issuance group within the profitability group, it remains in that group forever. New contracts in the same line of business can be in different groups, but that same contract can't be moved out of one group and into another. And so the hierarchy goes portfolios, profitability groups, issuance groups. Once you've sorted them out into those tiers, based on your initial recognition, etc., you then start measuring or producing numbers for these groups over time. So at each subsequent measurement balance date, each issuance group must have its financial position quantified. That can be done, determined from scratch, kind of like from the ground up at that group level, or you may determine at a high level and apportion the numbers to those groups levels. But regardless of which way, top down or bottom up method you choose, you need to produce some numbers for those for that group level, which is why it's important. Data management is even more important here, because think about through all your reporting before IFRS 17, how many ad hoc adjustments you had to make when you didn't have to manage all of these groupings. Now with IFRS 17, you have to sort them into portfolios and profitability groups and issuance groups. You need to have a streamlined process for the data management. And so if you don't have the process streamlined, then it could actually result in significant amount of effort and also errors over time. And so that's something that I believe companies should be investing more money in, which is in the data management system. It actually probably will result in lower company expenses in the long run. But the issue is it's a short-term pain, right? So you may need to fork out a lot of money for a little benefit in the shorter run. And so having too many groups will definitely increase the data requirements. So there's a balance to play here. And so now I have a final illustration where I'm putting all of these bits together. And so with this illustration, what I've, I guess, believe something that visualizes everything is a cube. And what I want you to think of this is that your policies are kind of like this entire large cube is your company. You're dividing this company, segregating this company in three ways. You have your portfolios, you have your profitability groups, and you have your issuance groups. Now, each one of these subcubes over here are that lower level of grain that I'm talking about. And once you've determined that your policy fits in there, then you can see the gaps I've put between those little cubes. That policy doesn't hop into a different category. That one cube over here tagged R means remaining contracts, or O means onerous. Once it's been tagged in that way, the policies in a subcube could eventually become profit making, even though it was tagged as onerous, or the one that has no significant possibility of becoming onerous could actually become loss making in the future. But that is kind of like the result, whereas these bits here is kind of like initially you're segregating your contracts into these, I guess, predefined buckets based on your initial expectations. And that's all I have for you guys today. So I hope that you guys have felt like you've received some real value from me. And if you like, I'm going to open it up for questions before I completely close it off. So I'll pass it back to Steve.
Yeah, thank you so much, Owen. You've got a real gift for making complex things simple. So thank you for doing that in such a short window of time. As you mentioned, opening this up for questions. If you have any questions of Owen, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A and try and get to as many as possible. Maybe in the absence of anything at the moment, I might take the advantage of asking you a question, if that's okay. I guess, do you see anything in terms of trends from the industry in terms of, obviously there's a lot of subjectivity in this, and is there a push by insurers to try and get that grain to the highest level as possible, and are we getting some pushback from auditors and the profession on that? Or, I guess, are you getting any feel for trends in that space?
Yeah, well, I've seen some insurers that definitely try to push right up to the top, and definitely had some pushback. And what I feel like most companies are doing is, I mean, I guess just kind of like being humans, we generally don't want to change our current reporting. So companies have mapped their data in a certain level of or a certain mapping structure, and so companies want to, as much as possible, keep those levels of mapping or work around that. So that's kind of like where I see companies are moving towards.
And there's a bit of a like underlying risk there. If you make an assessment, it's quite subjective. If you make an assessment and then based on best endeavors, but then it's something that's disagreed with when it comes to financial reporting time. I guess, are there any tips that you might have for protecting that decision and ensuring that it doesn't get reversed? Because I'm sure it'd be quite complex to undo if your interpretation is not supported at the end of the day.
Yeah, well, I guess nothing's impossible, but definitely, like, you'll save yourself a lot of pain if you like thinking about. I think that one important bit is all of this portfolios and groupings. You can think of it in isolation, but you probably want to think of that in the context of everything else. IFRS 17 applies to everything, and there are different dimensions, but they all work together. So I think when determining the portfolios and the products and the groupings, think about how your management reports may look like in the future. Think about how you might plan for these in the future. Think about how your statutory, a draft of how you're going to present these in the future. And so I think all of that is quite important to consider in conjunction when you're determining your level of aggregation.
That's good advice. We don't have any questions coming through, so it looks like maybe you've explained it perfectly. But I think Oh, and hopefully I'm not going out on a limb here, but if you do have any questions, I guess the contact details are there as well. And I don't know if you're open to taking any questions from the
Yeah.
members if they have anything subsequent to this presentation. Well, we do have one here from Stephen. Can you please organise a presentation on how to treat premium receivable in the context of liabilities for remaining coverage, covering policies on instalments? I think it's a good suggestion, and we're definitely open to ideas for future webinars. So please absolutely share any ideas, including we'll take this on board, share it with the FSAA, and we'll work with you, Owen, and see if we can organise something on other topics throughout the year.
Yeah, for sure. Let's take that away. And yeah, if you guys have any other topics that you want me to present on, just send them towards the FSAA and we can work something out.
Perfect. All right, well, thank you so much for your time today, Owen. Like I said, it was a great summary, and I really appreciate all the effort that you put into preparing for this and running us through it. So yeah, have a good afternoon, and thank you all for participating today.
Thanks, guys. Catch you guys later.
Thank you.